Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So today we're going to be tackling a topic that I find incredibly fascinating, intersectionality.
Yes. Understanding how different aspects of the person's identity can kind of overlap, right?
Exactly. It's like we often talk about things like race or our gender or our class as if they're separate issues. But the reality is, for so many people, those categories intersect and create these really complex experiences, especially when it comes to things like privilege and discrimination. And get this, you know how you sent me that stack of articles from the Discourse Analyzer AI toolkit?
Oh, yeah. That was a fascinating collection.
Well, it turns out that there's a whole field of study dedicated to exploring intersectionality through the lens of language. It's called, well, get ready for it, Intersectional Discourse Analysis.
Okay, I see where we're going with this. So basically, we're going to be looking at how language itself reflects those complex layers of identity and how it can impact things like power dynamics and social inequality.
You got it. And the articles you sent cover a really impressive range, too, from the theoretical foundations of this approach to some of the criticisms and challenges it faces. We even have case studies of some of the key figures in the field: Crenshaw, Collins, Lorde, Anzaldúa, and Hooks.
I'm really curious to see how their ideas have shaped this field.
Me too. I think it's going to be really eye-opening to see how the language we use every day can subtly reinforce those societal power structures.
And how, by recognizing those patterns, we can actually start to challenge those dynamics.
Exactly. So where do we even begin with a topic this big?
Well, I think a good starting point would be with the woman who coined the term intersectionality, Kimberlé Crenshaw.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
She's like the pioneer of this whole field. Back in the 80s, her work really shook things up, especially in the legal world.
Yeah, I remember reading about her critique of how the law often looks at discrimination as either race-based or gender-based.
Right. Like you're either discriminated against because of your race or because of your gender, but it can't be both at the same time.
Yeah, and Crenshaw was like, hold up, that's not how it works for a lot of people, especially Black women. Those single-axis frameworks just completely miss the mark.
Totally. And she used a really powerful example to illustrate her point: the DeGraff and Reed v. General Motors case.
Oh, yeah, wasn't that the case where a group of Black women sued General Motors for discrimination, but their case was dismissed because the court couldn't fit their claims into either a racial or a gender category?
Exactly. It was like they were being told, well, you're experiencing discrimination, but it doesn't fit into our neat little boxes, so too bad.
It's like trying to understand a 3D object by only looking at its shadow, right? You're missing an entire dimension of the experience.
Such a good analogy.
Yeah.
And Crenshaw didn't just point out the problem. She pushed for solutions. She challenged both feminist and anti-racist movements to move beyond those single-issue approaches and really embrace a more holistic, intersectional understanding of social justice.
Her work has had a huge ripple effect. It's influenced public policy, legal frameworks, and even the way we think about identity and inequality in general.
And what's really exciting for our deep dive is that Crenshaw's work gave discourse analysts a whole new set of tools to explore these issues.
Right. We can actually examine how language itself can be used to either build or undermine those power structures that Crenshaw was talking about.
It's like shining a light on the subtle ways that language shapes our perceptions and reinforces those inequalities.
And that's where discourse analysis comes in, right? We can analyze all sorts of texts, academic papers, news articles, speeches, to see how language is being used to either embrace or resist those intersectional ideas.
Exactly. It's about looking beyond the surface level of what's being said and really digging into how language is being used to shape our understanding of the world.
And Crenshaw really laid the groundwork for that kind of analysis. It's like she provided the map, and now we can use it to explore all these different landscapes of language and power.
Love that analogy.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got Crenshaw setting the stage, and then comes Patricia Hill Collins, who really delves into the experiences of Black women in America. Her book, Black Feminist Thought, is like a foundational text in this area.
Oh, yeah. Collins' work is so powerful. One of her key arguments is that Black women, because of their unique position in society, have developed distinct ways of knowing and understanding the world. She calls it Black feminist epistemology.
And that idea really challenges those traditional notions of objectivity in research, doesn't it? Like, there's this one single truth that applies to everyone, regardless of their background or experiences.
Right. Collins was like, nope, that's not how it works. She argued that this so-called objectivity often just reflects the perspectives of those in power, and it often overlooks the experiences and the knowledge of marginalized groups, especially Black women.
So instead of pretending we can be completely neutral and objective, we need to acknowledge our own biases and be more transparent about our perspectives. Like, where are we coming from? What are our assumptions? How might those be shaping the way we see the world?
It's about recognizing that knowledge production itself is not this neutral process. It's deeply intertwined with power dynamics and social hierarchies.
And Collins takes this a step further by examining how those power dynamics play out in the way Black women are portrayed in the media.
Right. She identified what she called controlling images.
Oh, yeah, those harmful stereotypes, right? Like the mammy, the Jezebel, the welfare queen.
Yeah.
These images that get repeated over and over again.
Exactly. And these images don't just reflect reality, they actually shape it by reinforcing negative perceptions and limiting opportunities for Black women.
It's like they create this self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right. And Collins argues that these controlling images are part of a larger system of oppression that she calls the matrix of domination.
Okay, unpack that one for me.
Sure. So the matrix of domination is this idea that different forms of oppression like racism, sexism, classism don't just exist in isolation. They actually intersect and reinforce each other, creating unique forms of oppression for different groups.
It's like a web of interconnected systems that work together to maintain social hierarchies.
Exactly. And just like with Crenshaw's work, we can use Collins' insights to analyze discourse. We can look at how those controlling images are being used in today's media and how that language contributes to the power dynamics within institutions like, education, the legal system, the media itself.
It's about seeing how language is used to either challenge or reinforce those dominant narratives and power structures that Collins was talking about.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another incredibly influential thinker in this space, Audre Lorde.
Oh, yes. Lorde's work is so powerful. She really focused on those intersections of race, gender, and sexuality.
And she was such a fierce advocate for inclusivity within the feminist movement.
Right. She was constantly challenging white feminists to recognize and address the unique experiences of women of color.
One of her most famous quotes is, "Your silence will not protect you."
It's so true. She believed that speaking out, sharing our personal experiences, was absolutely essential for dismantling systems of oppression. She was all about the idea that the personal is political.
Meaning that our individual experiences are not isolated incidents, but often reflect those broader social and political realities.
And by sharing our stories, we can connect with others, build solidarity, and start to challenge those systems that are causing those shared experiences of oppression.
Exactly. And I think we can apply Lorde's ideas to discourse analysis in some really interesting ways.
I was just thinking the same thing. Like, we could use her insights to analyze the language used in activist movements today. We could look at speeches, writings, social media posts, and see how her call for intersectionality is shaping those discussions around social justice.
And it's not just about the content of those messages, it's also about who's speaking, who's being listened to, whose voices are being amplified.
Right. Because even within movements that are striving for inclusivity, there can still be those hierarchies and those exclusions based on race, gender, sexuality, and other identities.
And Lorde was really pushing us to be more critical of those power dynamics, even within social movements themselves.
Okay, so we've got Crenshaw, Collins, and Lorde, all these amazing thinkers laying the groundwork for understanding intersectionality. And then we have Gloria Anzaldúa, who I think add a whole other dimension to the conversation.
Oh, absolutely. Anzaldúa's work is so groundbreaking because it really challenges those rigid categories and binaries that we often use to understand identity.
And she does this through her concept of borderlands, right?
Exactly. She uses that term to describe those spaces where cultures and identities clash and blend, creating something new and hybrid. It's not just about those physical borders between countries. It's about those internal borders we create within ourselves and within our communities.
Those places where our identities intersect and overlap in all these messy, beautiful ways.
Yeah, it's about fluidity and multiplicity, rejecting the idea that we have to fit neatly into these predefined boxes.
And Anzaldúa's own life is a testament to that idea. She grew up Chicana, navigating between English, Spanish, Tex-Mex, and even Nahuatl. Her writing is full of this beautiful code-switching, seamlessly blending languages and cultural references.
It's a really powerful way of expressing the complexity of her identity and challenging that idea that we have to choose one fixed category over another.
And in discourse analysis, we can apply Anzaldúa's ideas to explore how people in multilingual and multicultural communities use language to construct and express those really fluid identities.
Yeah, it's about recognizing the richness and fluidity of language itself and how it can be used to challenge those dominant monolithic narratives that try to put everyone into neat little boxes.
I think Anzaldúa would be all about embracing that messiness, that in-betweenness.
Totally. Seeing the beauty in those liminal spaces where identities are constantly evolving and transforming.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here, but there's one more key figure we need to talk about. Bell Hooks.
Ah, yes, Hooks. Her work is so important. She was an incredibly influential feminist scholar and activist who really pushed the boundaries of feminist theory to include the voices and experiences of women of color and working class women.
Because she was saying, hey, mainstream feminism often overlooks the needs and perspectives of these groups. It's not a one-size-fits-all movement.
Right, and she was all about making those connections between race, gender, class, and other forms of oppression.
She was also a huge believer in the power of education and media to challenge stereotypes and promote those more diverse intersectional representations that we've been talking about.
She was all about critical thinking, questioning assumptions, and challenging those dominant narratives that perpetuate inequality.
And that's where her ideas connect with discourse analysis, right? We can analyze things like classroom interactions, media representations, and see how those power dynamics are playing out in those spaces.
Yeah, are those interactions reflecting the diversity and complexity of human experience? Or are they perpetuating the same old harmful stereotypes and power imbalances?
Exactly. It's about looking at who's being heard, whose knowledge is being valued, and how those dynamics are shaped by race, gender, class, and all those other factors we've been discussing.
It's about holding a mirror up to our culture and asking, are we truly embracing intersectionality? Or are we just paying lip service to the idea while still clinging to those same old ways of thinking and communicating?
That's such a powerful question, and it's a question that I think we need to be asking ourselves constantly.
Absolutely. So we've explored the contributions of these incredible thinkers, Crenshaw, Collins, Lorde, Anzaldúa, and Hooks, and their work has really laid the foundation for a much richer and more nuanced understanding of intersectionality.
It's like they've given us this incredible toolbox filled with all these different lenses and perspectives that we can use to understand how language shapes our world and how we can use language to create a more just and equitable society.
And speaking of tools, our source material goes on to outline a whole range of methods that researchers use to analyze discourse through this intersectional lens.
Oh yeah, like specific techniques and approaches they use to really dig into those complexities. I'm really curious to see how those work in practice.
Me too. I think it'll be fascinating to explore those different methods and see how they can be applied to real-world examples of language and power dynamics.
Absolutely. I'm ready to dive in.
Ah,
Okay, so we're ready to dig into those methods for analyzing discourse through this intersectional lens. Where do we start?
well, our source material actually highlights several criticisms and challenges of intersectional discourse analysis before it dives into those methods. It's kind of like they're acknowledging that this approach, while super powerful, isn't without its complexities.
I can see that. I mean, we've already talked about how intersectionality itself is about acknowledging the nuances and the complexities of how different identities interact. So I imagine trying to analyze that through language can get pretty tricky.
Exactly. And one of the main criticisms is that it can actually become so complex that it's hard to put into practice, you know? Like, if you're trying to account for every single intersection, every single nuance of a person's identity, it can lead to what some researchers call analysis paralysis.
Analysis paralysis. I like that. So you're basically saying you get so bogged down in the details that you can't see the forest for the trees.
Yeah, pretty much. It's like you're trying to juggle too many balls at once and you just end up dropping them all.
Makes sense. So that's one challenge. Overcomplicating things. What else is there?
Well, there's also the opposite problem, oversimplification.
Oh, right, like swinging too far in the other direction.
Exactly. We can't just reduce these complex intersections to a checklist of identities, you know? Like, okay, this person is Black, female, and working class, so check, check, check. That misses the whole point of intersectionality.
Right. It's not just about adding up identities. It's about recognizing how they interact and shape each other in all these unique and dynamic ways. It's about those nuances.
Exactly. Another challenge is making sure that the analysis is actually inclusive.
Oh, that's a good point. Even when we're trying to focus on marginalized groups, there's always the risk of unintentionally excluding certain perspectives.
Yeah, like maybe you focus so much on the intersections of race and gender that you end up overlooking the experiences of people with disabilities or LGBTQ plus individuals.
It's like you're trying to create a map of this super diverse landscape.
Yeah.
You got to be careful not to leave out any of those important features.
Exactly. And then there's this tension between theoretical rigor and real-world
Oh,
application.
yeah, the classic ivory tower versus the real-world dilemma.
Right. Some critics argue that intersectional discourse analysis can get so caught up in academic jargon and abstract theories that it becomes difficult to actually translate those insights into real strategies for social change. Like, how do you actually take these ideas and apply them to things like policymaking, education, media representation?
So it's great to have all this theory, but it's got to be grounded in reality and actually lead to some tangible changes, right?
Exactly. I think those are all valid criticisms, and it's important to be mindful of them as we delve deeper into this field.
I agree. It's like intersectional discourse analysis is a really powerful tool, but like any tool, it needs to be used carefully and thoughtfully. We need to acknowledge those limitations and constantly be pushing ourselves to make sure our analysis is accurate, nuanced, and actually contributing to positive social change.
Couldn't agree more. Okay, so with those caveats in mind, let's dive into some of the actual methods that researchers use in this field.
Yeah, let's get into the nuts and bolts of it. What you got?
Well, our source material highlights a whole bunch of approaches, each with its own strengths and limitations. We've got multi-layered analysis, narrative methods, ethnographic content analysis, critical discourse analysis, which people often shorten to CDA frame analysis, positioning theory, and even visual discourse analysis.
Oh, that's a lot. Sounds like researchers are really getting creative with adapting those different methods to explore those complexities of intersectionality in language.
Yeah, exactly. And it's important to remember that choosing the right method often depends on what specific question you're trying to answer and the kind of data you're working with. Sometimes a single method will do the trick, but a lot of times it's helpful to combine different approaches to really capture that full picture.
Okay, so multi-layered analysis. What is that one all about?
So at its core, it's basically about analyzing a text on multiple levels.
Okay, sounds pretty straightforward so far. What are those different levels?
Well, the first thing to remember is that no text exists in a vacuum, right?
Yeah.
It's always a product of its historical, cultural, and social context. So in multi-layered analysis, you're not just looking at the words on the page, you're also considering all those broader forces that shaped those words.
Okay, so you might look at like the historical events that influence the creation of a text, the cultural norms and values it reflects, even the political climate at the time.
Exactly. You're trying to understand the text within its full context, not just as this isolated thing. And then within the text itself, you're looking for those recurring themes and patterns that relate to identity and power.
Like how those themes are presented, how they intersect across different dimensions of identity, how they might reinforce or challenge those existing social hierarchies.
I got it.
I can see how this multi-layered approach would be useful for analyzing something like a political speech, right? Where those power dynamics are often front and center.
Absolutely. It allows you to really peel back the layers and see how language is being used to construct and maintain those power structures.
Okay, cool. What about narrative methods? This one sounds really interesting to me.
Yeah, narrative methods are all about using personal stories and narratives to understand how people experience intersectionality in their own lives.
I love that. It seems so much more grounded and human-centered than just analyzing like abstract concepts.
Totally. It's about giving voice to those who are often marginalized or silenced, recognizing that everyone has a story to tell and that those stories can offer these really valuable insights into the complexities of the human experience.
So instead of just analyzing, say, academic texts or media representations, you're actually listening to people's lived experiences, hearing their stories in their own words.
Exactly. It's like stepping into someone else's shoes for a bit and trying to see the world from their perspective.
And it's not just about the content of those narratives either, right? It's also about how those stories are told, the language people use, the metaphors, the emotions they express. All those choices can tell us something about how they make sense of their experiences.
Exactly. What are those recurring themes? What are those key metaphors? What are the silences, the things that aren't being said?
Yeah, that's powerful stuff. It's really about connecting with those lived experiences and recognizing the diversity and the richness of human perspectives.
Yeah.
Okay, another one that caught my eye was ethnographic content analysis. It sounds like it combines two different approaches.
Yeah, it's like a blend of content analysis, which is this systematic way of analyzing texts, with ethnographic research, which is all about immersing yourself in a particular cultural setting to really understand it from the inside out.
So you're not just analyzing the text itself, you're also trying to understand the social and cultural context in which it was created and is being received.
Exactly. You might spend time observing the community or group that created the text, conduct interviews, take field notes, really try to understand the cultural nuances and meanings that might not be immediately obvious to an outsider.
Like you're not just reading the text, you're living it.
In a way, yeah. And then you bring that understanding back to the text and analyze it with a much deeper appreciation for those layers of meaning.
It's like you're getting this insider perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, and it highlights the idea that meaning isn't inherent in the text itself, but emerges through the interaction between the text and the reader. And that understanding the reader's cultural background and perspective is key for a nuanced analysis.
Okay, let's talk about critical discourse analysis, or CDA.
Ah, yes, CDA. This one's really interesting. It's all about uncovering those ways that power and ideology operate through language.
So it's about seeing those hidden agendas, those power dynamics that are often lurking beneath the surface of our communication.
You got it. And when we apply this to intersectionality, we're looking at how language is used to construct and maintain those social hierarchies based on race, gender, class, all those different identities.
It's like learning to read between the lines, to see those subtle messages about who's in control, who's being marginalized, and how language is being used to reinforce those inequalities.
Exactly. And CDA is particularly useful for analyzing texts that deal with sensitive or controversial topics where those power dynamics are often most obvious.
Like political speeches, news articles, even things like advertising or social media posts, right? Where those messages are carefully crafted to persuade or manipulate.
Absolutely. And one of the key techniques in CDA is identifying what we call discursive strategies.
What are those?
They're basically those ways that language is used to create and maintain power relations. For example, you might look at how language is used to frame certain groups or issues, or how certain voices are amplified while others are silenced.
So it's about paying attention not just to what's being said, but also to how it's being said, who's saying it, and whose voices are being left out of the conversation.
Precisely. CDA is all about peeling back those layers and seeing how language can be used to create a particular version of reality one that often serves the interests of those in power.
It's like we often think of language as being this objective tool for describing the world, but CDA shows us that it's actually being used to construct that world in very specific ways.
Exactly. And by becoming aware of those processes, we can start to challenge those dominant narratives that perpetuate inequality and start to create more just and equitable ways of using language.
Okay, what about frame analysis?
So frame analysis highlights how the way we present information can dramatically influence how it's perceived. It's like those optical illusions where you can look at the same image and see two completely different things depending on how it's framed.
Oh yeah, those things are crazy. Like that one, they can be either a vase or two faces looking at each other.
Exactly. We all have these mental frameworks or frames that we use to make sense of the world.
Like mental shortcuts, right?
Kind of.
Right.
And these frames are shaped by all sorts of things. Our experiences, our beliefs, the cultural narratives we've been exposed to, and they act like filters, influencing how we process and interpret information.
So in discourse analysis, frame analysis is about identifying those frames and seeing how they shape the way we talk about and understand certain issues.
Right. You might look at how a news article frames a certain social issue. What language do they use? What metaphors do they employ? What aspects of the issue do they choose to emphasize or downplay?
Those choices can really impact how readers understand that issue and form their opinions, right?
Absolutely. And when you combine frame analysis with intersectionality, you can start to see how those frames can either reinforce or challenge those power structures related to race, gender, class, and so on.
It's about seeing those subtle ways that language can be used to perpetuate inequality, often without us even realizing it.
Exactly. It's about becoming more conscious of how language shapes our thinking and choosing to use language in a way that promotes understanding, empathy, and justice.
So it's not just about identifying those frames, it's about understanding their implications and challenging those frames that perpetuate harmful stereotypes or biases.
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm ready for the next method. What's next?
Okay, this one's called positioning theory. This one looks at how we use language to position ourselves and others within social interactions.
It's like we're all actors on a stage, constantly negotiating our roles and relationships through language.
Yeah, great analogy. And positioning theory highlights how our identities and the power dynamics at play really shape those roles and those relationships.
Can you give me an example of that?
Sure, think about a conversation between a doctor and a patient. The doctor is typically positioned as the expert with the authority to diagnose and treat, right? The patient is positioned as the one seeking help and guidance.
Okay, so in that interaction, their roles are already kind of predetermined by their positions within that system.
Exactly. And positioning theory is about analyzing how those positions are established and negotiated through language.
And how those positions might reinforce those broader social hierarchies, right?
Right. Like, are certain individuals consistently positioned as experts or leaders while others are positioned as followers or subordinates? And how do those positions align with social categories like race, gender, class, and so on?
Those implicit biases we all carry can actually manifest in the way we interact and communicate with each other.
Exactly. And becoming more aware of those dynamics can help us make more conscious choices to challenge those hierarchies and create more equitable interactions. It's about using language to empower, to create connection, and to foster that sense of belonging.
It's like actively choosing to step out of those predefined roles and create something new, something more just and equitable.
Right.
Okay, I think we have one more method to cover. Visual discourse analysis. This one seems pretty self-explanatory, but I'm sure there's more to it than meets the eye, right?
You got that right. It's about recognizing that discourse isn't just limited to spoken or written language. Visual discourse analysis is all about examining those images, videos, and other visual forms of communication and seeing how they contribute to those broader conversations about identity, power, and social inequality.
So we're talking about things like advertising, film, television, social media, but basically anything that uses visuals to get a message across.
Exactly. We can analyze those visuals to see how they portray different social groups, how they frame certain issues, and how they might be contributing to those dominant narratives about race, gender, class, and all those other factors.
Yeah, it's like those visuals often work on a subconscious level, shaping our perceptions and reinforcing those societal norms without us even realizing it.
Exactly. And visual discourse analysis allows us to bring those messages to the surface and examine them with a more critical eye.
Like, are those images challenging stereotypes? Or are they just perpetuating them? Are they promoting diversity and inclusion? Or are they reinforcing those same old power structures?
Those are the questions. It's about recognizing that visuals aren't just neutral. They're carefully constructed to convey certain messages and reinforce certain values.
So it's about becoming more aware of those visual cues and how they're being used to shape our understanding of the world.
Absolutely.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah.
It's amazing to see how many different methods researchers are using to explore intersectionality in language.
It's a really dynamic and growing field. And I think what's become clear is that it's all about embracing complexity.
Right. There's no one-size-fits-all approach. It's about recognizing the nuances of how identity, power, and language intersect and being flexible and adaptable in our analysis.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've explored the methods, but what about the theory behind all of this? What are the underlying frameworks that inform this approach? Okay, so we've got all these amazing tools and approaches for analyzing discourse, but to really understand how they work, we need to talk about the theory, right?
Yeah,
What are those big ideas that underpin all of this?
you got it. Intersectional discourse analysis draws inspiration from a whole bunch of different theories, each offering its own unique perspective. Our source material actually highlights 5 major theoretical frameworks: post-structuralism, critical race theory, feminist theory, Marxist theory, and post-colonial theory. It's like having this really rich tapestry of ideas that all kind of weave together to help us understand those complex relationships between identity, power, and language.
Okay, so let's try to untangle some of those threads. Let's start with post-structuralism. Full disclosure, I've always found this one a bit hard to wrap my head around.
Yeah, it can be a little mind-bending, but essentially, post-structuralism challenges the idea that language is just this neutral tool for reflecting reality. It's more like language is actually the place where meanings are constantly being created, negotiated, and debated. It's a process, not a fixed system.
Okay, so it's not just about what we say, but how we say it, who gets to say it, and in what context. The meaning isn't just sitting there in the words themselves, it's created through that interaction between language, power, and social context.
Exactly. And when you apply that to intersectionality, you start to see how language can actually be used to create and reinforce those social hierarchies we've been talking about.
Like the way we label or categorize people based on race, gender, or other identities can have a huge impact on how they're perceived and treated in the real world.
Right. Those categories aren't neutral. They carry all this historical baggage and these cultural assumptions that shape our understanding of different groups. And those understandings can then be used to justify all sorts of discrimination and inequality.
It's like those words become these powerful tools for shaping our perceptions and our actions.
Exactly. Post-structuralism helps us see that language isn't just mirroring reality, it's actively shaping it. And by understanding how those processes work, we can start to challenge those dominant narratives and create more equitable and just ways of using language.
Okay, that's post-structuralism. What about critical race theory? I feel like this one has been getting a lot of attention and a lot of controversy lately.
Yeah, it definitely has. It's become really politicized, which is a shame because at its core, critical race theory, or CRT, offers these crucial insights into how racism is embedded in our social structures and institutions. It's about recognizing that racism isn't just about those individual prejudices, those bad apples. It's actually woven into the very fabric of our society, often in those really subtle and insidious ways.
It's like those invisible systems that keep certain groups from accessing the same opportunities and resources as others.
Yeah,
Right?
exactly. And when we apply CRT to discourse analysis, we can start to see how those racist ideas and assumptions manifest in the way we communicate.
So we might look at how different racial groups are represented in the media, how language is used to frame those discussions about race and racism, even how policies that seem neutral on the surface can actually have these disparate impacts on different racial groups.
Absolutely. CRT helps us develop that critical awareness of how language can be used to both uphold and dismantle those racist systems. It encourages us to really examine our own language and consider how our words might be, even unintentionally, perpetuating those harmful ideologies.
Okay, what about feminist theory?
So, feminist theory is all about understanding how gender shapes our experiences in the world.
And how those experiences are often unequal, right?
Right. It's about challenging those traditional gender roles and expectations that limit women's opportunities and reinforce male dominance. And it recognizes that gender isn't just this biological category, but a social construct that shapes everything from our identities and relationships to our opportunities in life.
And when we apply that to discourse analysis, we can start to see how language is used to create and maintain those gendered power dynamics.
Exactly. We might analyze how men and women are portrayed in literature or film, or how certain professions get labeled as masculine or feminine.
Or even how everyday language can be used to reinforce stereotypes and limit opportunities for women. Like, think about how certain words are used to describe assertive women versus assertive men.
Right. Those subtle differences in language can reveal those deeper power imbalances.
So feminist theory helps us see how language can be used to either challenge or reinforce those traditional gender roles. It encourages us to be more mindful of how our words might be contributing to those gender inequalities, even unintentionally.
Absolutely. And that brings us to Marxist theory.
Okay, Marxist theory. I know this one focuses on economic systems and class structures, but how does it connect to discourse analysis?
So, the basic premise of Marxist theory is that our economic system, capitalism, is inherently unequal, and that inequality permeates every aspect of society, including language.
It's not just about the money, right? It's about power, control, and how those who have power maintain their dominance over others.
Exactly. And Marxist theory is particularly interested in how language is used to create and maintain those class divisions.
So we might look at how the media portrays different socioeconomic groups, or how we talk about things like wealth and poverty. Even something as simple as the language we use in everyday conversations can reflect and reinforce those class-based hierarchies.
Right. Think about all those subtle ways we categorize people based on their socioeconomic status, like blue-collar versus white-collar jobs, or how we often associate certain accents or dialects with specific social classes.
And those distinctions can have real-world consequences, right? It can shape how we perceive people, how we treat them, and even what opportunities we offer them.
Absolutely. Marxist theory helps us see those subtle ways that language can be used to perpetuate economic inequality, often without us even realizing it. It encourages us to be more critical of how we talk about these issues and to actively work towards creating a more just and equitable distribution of resources.
Okay, last but not least, we have post-colonial theory. I feel like this one is particularly relevant to our conversation about intersectionality.
It really is. Post-colonial theory focuses on the lasting impacts of colonialism on culture, identity, and those power dynamics we've been talking about. It recognizes that colonialism wasn't just a historical event, but an ongoing process that continues to shape our world today.
So even though those formal empires might have crumbled, those power structures and those ways of thinking often persist in more subtle and insidious ways.
Exactly. And postcolonial theory is particularly interested in how language is used to create and maintain those power dynamics.
So we might look at things like how Western media portrays people from formerly colonized countries, or how we talk about global politics and economics, or even how certain languages are privileged over others.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that language carries the weight of history and power, and that those power dynamics can have a profound impact on how we see ourselves, how we relate to each other, and how we understand the world around us.
It's like language itself can become a tool of colonization
Yeah.
or a tool of resistance, depending on how it's used.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've now explored these five major theoretical frameworks: post-structuralism, critical race theory, feminist theory, Marxist theory, and postcolonial theory. And each one offers this valuable lens for understanding the complexities of intersectional discourse analysis. It's amazing to see how they can work together to give us this more nuanced and holistic perspective on how identity, power, and language intersect.
And I think what's really exciting is that these frameworks aren't just about analyzing and deconstructing systems of power. It's about using that knowledge to create a more just and equitable world.
It's about empowering ourselves and others to use language in a way that promotes understanding, respect, and equality for everyone.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing the power of language and using that power to challenge oppression, amplify those marginalized voices, and build a more inclusive and just society.
Well, I have to say, this deep dive has really been eye-opening for me. I'm going to be paying much closer attention to the language I use and the language I encounter out in the world.
Me too. It's like once you start seeing those patterns, you can't unsee them.
Yeah, so true. And I think that awareness is the first step towards creating real change. So to our listeners out there, we encourage you to continue exploring these ideas. Pay attention to the language you use, the language you hear in the media, in your conversations, even in your own thoughts. Ask yourself, how are those subtle linguistic choices shaping your perceptions of yourself and the world around you? And how can you use language to create a more just and equitable world? We hope this deep dive has given you some food for thought and some tools to start making a difference. Thanks for joining us.